So they get these photographs. On my way, Mom. Yeah, exactly. It's been real fun.
I'm doing fine, thank you. There's the youth program for the high school. When do they meet? Oh, so the same time as the cooking hour? Okay. My high school's daughter she goes back and forth here, but it's just a long story coming out of the old church, and then we went to that church, and she's like, I don't want to go to another church. So hopefully her and my husband will come Sunday. I say that every Sunday, but it's always hope. Yeah. That'd be great. Yeah, my daughter's a little shy. I was wondering if someone might want to just come say hi to her or something, just to kind of break the ice there, so she's not walking into a brand new room again. And, yeah, that'd be great. On Sunday,
Anyways, I was there today.
So we can help you find where she needs to go.
yeah, that'd be great.
I'm taking her to the airport.
It would be better if they did.
The ninth.
We were kind of shopping.
When you start your new position, November 22. Awesome. You'll do great.
What are you doing?
Oh, yeah? Wow, nice. Good for you. Are you excited? Is this your first time in the field that you've trained up there? Nice. When do you start? Where at? Okay. Nice.
So I've actually been like this almost then I'm just taking
Master, so you didn't know that Emily made a book that had the creation in it.
Who did?
Emily, your daughter.
Oh, she did?
Yes, you should look it up. It's pretty good, I think.
Recently?
Huh?
Did she do that recently?
It's in a folder.
Okay.
No, recently.
Huh?
Recently.
Yeah, not this last year, but the year before when we had day camps, they just during that time.
Okay. Awesome.
So I did a book of creation.
Awesome.
It was fun. I was thinking about doing a book on fruits of the fear.
That'd be good too.
That's a lot of work. I don't know if I'm ready for it.
That would be good. Really good.
And you live in the city.
All right. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. So glad you are here tonight. Welcome back. Beautiful day today, and hope you got to get a chance to get outside a little bit and enjoy the fall. I went for a run before I got here, so that felt super good. Not many days like that left before the snow flies, but I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a good week. We're about halfway through the semester. Thanksgiving's coming up, Christmas is coming up, so got some things looking forward to and some breaks coming up, so that will be really nice. Schedule-wise, if you want to open to the first page of your notes again, just to remind ourselves of the schedule. So we're on October 28th. We're in Genesis 1 tonight. Next week, Genesis 1 still scheduled for November 4, so we're actually kind of still on schedule for that. And then diving into Genesis 2 for a couple of weeks after that before Thanksgiving. So just kind of wanted to give you a preview of where we're going. Please, if you can, read the appropriate sections in Genesis 1 and 2 before class. So if you've already read Genesis 1, you're good to go for next week. But if you can read it again prior to next week, especially the end, we're going to try and get days 5 and 6 next week if we can get through the material, which I'm not sure that ever happens. But we love all the conversation and love all the discussion. So it's wonderful. So that's where we're going. Just a reminder, no class Thanksgiving week, and so you can get a week off for that. Also, just a reminder, our TES seminar is coming up November 13 and 14. So there's information on how to sign up for that in the bulletin. There is a small fee for that. We'll be back in this room Friday night and Saturday. So I know it's busy, everyone's busy, but if you'd love just to come and be fed spiritually, would love to have you for that seminar. So please just register for that. And that's coming up in about 2 weeks, I guess, from this weekend. So looking forward to that. Yeah,
How do you register?
There's a flyer in the bulletin that has a website address on it.
Okay.
And so if you just go to that website, there's a sign-up form right there. So those flyers should be in the bulletin again on Sunday.
Okay.
So if you need help after that, let me know. Yeah, Buzz.
Just one item on that, Todd. I did it the other day. I went on the TES, just the regular thing,
Yep.
and you get into the seminars and conferences, and then a link will take you there. My one caution is when you put your name in and your billing information and all that kind of stuff, it told you earlier to put a hyphen after your last name for which location you would be at.
Okay.
I did not do that in that first step, thinking I was going to get another step. I never got another step.
You know what that means? You have to go to Jupiter, Florida.
I know.
So
You got the plane fare?
if you start driving by Tuesday, you should be there in time. So,
I did edit it afterwards, but it didn't seem to show up on my ticket that
Okay.
way, but it showed up when I looked at it again, so I don't know.
it's all good.
So,
Good. Thanks for letting us know that.
yeah.
One last thing before we get started. Andy Rimby has brought a bunch of resources over here for you if you're interested in the topic that we're studying. Andy, you want to just give us a quick, just what's over there?
No, it's all answers in Genesis, very related to what we're going over, what a lot of the quotes that are references. We've spent many times at the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum and Ark, and so I just always picked them up, and they just sit on my shelf collecting dust. So there's lots of videos and books and whatever media you like.
Awesome. Borrow anything you want, right?
Yeah.
As long as I get it back to you.
Just bring it back Wednesday sometime, or
Great. Also have lots of resources down in the church library, which is a whole creation section down there. So if you're looking for good resources, that'd be a place to go as well. So let me open with a prayer and we'll begin. God, thanks for another evening, and thank you just for the joy of meeting together with our church family. We thank you for the time that we have to study your word and to dig into these opening chapters of the Bible, and thank you for the fact that they give us clear answers on the origins, and we're not left to wonder how it all began. So thank you for the clarity you've given us. We do pray that you bless our discussion this evening, and we pray that we can come away with a better understanding of your truth, your word. May it cause us to worship you and be more and more confident in the truth that you've given us. So be our teacher tonight, Father. I pray that you'll bless Awana as well as those kids are there learning your word. We pray for gospel seeds to be sown in the hearts of those young people, and Lord, may some of them come to know Christ even tonight. So we pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so just a couple things before we begin. You have two articles before you tonight. One are the notes for tonight. The other one is this article entitled Light Before the Sun. We got into this a little bit last week. What was that light on day one? Day 1 says God created the heavens and the earth, and he created light, and he separated the light from darkness. And so we had a long, kind of a protracted discussion on what could that light have been. The sun's not created till day 4, so what was that light source? And I just pulled an article off of Answers in Genesis for you. I can summarize it in 30 seconds and basically tell you we don't know. So there's the short answer. But there are some options here. If you would like to think a little bit more about what that light source might have been on day 1, just let me kind of hit highlights here. Some would say it's maybe a manifestation of Christ's glory, but the problem with that is Christ, when he says he's the light of the world, he's speaking metaphorically of truth. And so it's hard to imagine how him speaking metaphorically of truth could have translated into physical light on day 1. So maybe not the best option. Some would say at bottom of page 1 was this original source a pillar of fire that later became the sun, but that's got some difficulties in it. It's hard to know why would God create something like the sun and then actually create the sun. So not sure that's the best idea either. Then in the middle of page 2 was the source and essence of the sun, but without its substance. Again, you can read through that. That's a possibility. Bottom of page 2, what about the angels? Could they have been the luminaries? I think someone, Rachel, I think you mentioned that. Could it have been the angels themselves that were the light source? But you'll see that there are some problems with that view. It brings into the question how light from spiritual beings manifests itself as physical light in the universe. So again, maybe not the best view. Perhaps it was God's Shekinah glory on page 3. You can read through that. And then there's some other possibilities, maybe a moving light source or a proto-sun, or bottom of page 4, an unnamed temporary local light source, which is what Ken Ham actually takes it to be, an unnamed temporary, because the sun replaced it, a local light source. In other words, who knows what it was, but it was some sort of temporary light source. So you can read that article. I just wanted to pass that on to you and give you a resource if you wanted to explore that a little bit more, if you were really curious about what that light source is. So thoughts on that? Questions?
Got a wild one.
Go ahead, John.
The fireball from the Big Bang.
Another one could be the fireball from the Big Bang, yeah. Fraught with major difficulties, but we'll add it to the list. Good.
In Battle for the Beginning from John MacArthur, he just said it simply like this: if God created the sun to give light, then God could create the light without the sun.
Exactly.
So that was it. He just created light. Light was it, light, and that was it.
Exactly. I think we just have to leave it there.
Leave it there.
Be comfortable with that. Yep. All right, well, let's dive into our notes for tonight. We're on days 3 and 4. One just note before we dive into this: sometimes this stuff can get a little academic as we start talking about science and maybe what creation scientists believe, and I think sometimes we can get lost in some of the minutia, and I don't want that to happen. I want us to kind of wrestle through questions, talk through the issues, present some options, wrestle with the biblical text. But at the end of the day, at the end of class, really what this should do is this should cause us to worship. And so let's not forget that as we're going through this, as we're giving arguments for biblical creationism, six-day creationism. Let's not just work through this in a way that we want to be defensive, we want to just win arguments. That's not the goal, really. Ultimately, our goal is to know the Word, study the Word, be confident of what the Word says, so we can ultimately love Christ more and worship Him more as the sovereign creator of the universe. So that's really, I think, what we want to do here. We'll dive into it. We'll wrestle with some of the issues here, but ultimately we want our hearts, responding in wonder, love, and praise to our Savior. So just kind of a reminder for myself, even as I was studying and preparing for tonight. So let's dive into this. We're on day 3. So we've looked at the first 2 days last week, and we want to dive into the 3rd and 4th days tonight. So top of page 1, the first foundational division occurred on day 1. There was a separating of light from darkness. Then there was a second division that occurred on day 2, the separating of the waters below from the waters above. And so this evening we come to the 3rd foundational division that occurred on day 3, the separation of the land from the sea. And so if you notice, the first 3 days of creation all have separating events. Light from dark, waters below from waters above, and then land from sea. So these first 3 days are kind of defined by these foundational separations and divisions that are happening. And so as we come to day 3, we're going to see that there are two primary things that were created on this day. First would be the land and the seas, and then the second one would be vegetation, plant life. And so you can see what's happening here. You can see that the Lord is just getting the earth ready for life. And so up to this point, first 2 days, there's not any life yet. Even the first part of day 3, there's no life yet until we get to plant life at the end of day 3. So we're moving closer and closer to life. We're moving closer and closer to the world being inhabited by living creatures. So we're still in kind of the early stages. And so the first thing that we come to on day 3 is the creation of land and seas. So look in the middle of page 1 here, or look in your Bibles, Genesis 1, verses 9 and 10. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place." So remember, day 2, separation of waters above from waters below. So we have either a canopy of water above or somewhere out in space. Hey, Ewing, come on in. So we have this canopy above, and we've got this water below. And so on day 3, we're going to deal with those waters below, which are called seas. And so he says here in verse 9, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And I just, by way of comment, I love that phrase, "and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
so."
Yeah.
I mean, just think about that. God said, "Let this happen," and it happened. God said, "Let this happen," and it occurred. God said, "Let this happen," and it's exactly what he said. So again, just a reminder of the power of the Word of God. He speaks, and what he speaks occurs. That is power. And so just don't skip over some of these phrases that we're so familiar with. Even in the end of verse 10, God saw that was good. Sometimes I think we just skip over that. Yep, it's good. Yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be. But think about that. It's good. It's the exact way God has designed it. He spoke it, came into existence. Verse 10, God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So we have, prior to this, on the end of day 2, what is covering the entire earth? Water. Okay, so end of day 2, you have a sphere, you have earth, and it's completely covered on its surface with water. No land whatsoever. So day 3 sees the formation of the seas by putting them together into one place. That's what verse 9 says. And the creation of dry land. Note dry land. Not slime. Not mud. Not pits of, stuff you fall in and can't get out because it's so thick. Dry land. In fact, by the end of day 3, it's going to be dry enough to plant plants. Think about that. This land mass that had been previously entirely covered with water, at the end of this day, is going to be dry to the point that it can take plant life. Supernatural. That is what?
Kind of like when the Red Sea was split.
Kind of like the Red Sea. They didn't walk on mud and get their flip-flops all caught in the bottom of the Red Sea. No, it was dry. Again, we're seeing miraculous power of God displayed here. So, interesting to note here, verse 9, that the seas were gathered, the waters were gathered into one place. That word in the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The word there is synagogen, where we get our word synagogue, and a synagogue is a gathering place. So what you have here at the first part of day 3 is the creation of the seas, gathering them together into one place. Now, it could be, and actually this is probably where I would land, that it literally was one sea. One massive, almost global body of water, one sea, although it could be seas, it is plural in this verse, so it could be different seas that kind of make up one big massive sea. But regardless, it's mostly gathered into one place to the point that land could be then created out of that watery matrix. Bottom of page 1, there's just a bunch of passages. We're not going to go through all of them, but maybe I can highlight just a few of these. Other passages in Scripture that refer to this time when God pulled the waters together and he established the dry land. So Proverbs 8 speaks about when the springs of the deep became fixed and he set for the sea its boundary so that the water would not transgress his command. I love that. God says the seas need to go there and you're not going to go past that boundary, and he created the limits of the oceans and the limits of the seas. Bottom of the page, Psalm 104, he established the earth upon its foundations, so it will not totter forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. I don't think this is talking about the flood here. I think this is talking about the early days of creation, perhaps even day 3 here, where the waters were standing above the mountains, because that's where it was like at the end of day 2. The waters were covering the entire face of the earth. Then verse 7, Psalm 104 says, at your rebuke they fled, at the sound of your thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place where you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. I think that's a reference to day 3. I think that's what's happening on day 3. God is saying, waters go that way, land come up, let's form this dry land that the plants will grow on. All right? So that's what's happening here in the early part of day 3. Top of page 2. What we have here is the description of something that is not in existence today. So when we think creation of dry land, you can't think at this point necessarily North America, South America, Europe, that kind of thing. We are talking here about a cosmology that was very different from what we know today. And I'm going to give you some explanation on that in just a moment. But maybe turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 2 and just note some things about what this was like. So what we're going into right here is we're going to try and define what this land was like. And we want to look at maybe what some Scripture says about this. But some keys that we have about the dry land that was created on day 3 is that it was very different than what we are familiar with today. So we get some clues to this. Chapter 2, verse 5 and 6 says, no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord had not sent rain upon the earth. And there was no man to cultivate the ground, but a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. We don't know if that means that there was no rain before the flood at all, or if it just means up to this point there was no rain. But clearly up to this point in the creation account, there's no rain. There's just this mist, maybe a greenhouse kind of feel to it. So that's unique. We don't have that today unless you go to maybe a rainforest and get a little sample of that. But that's not the case either. Then skip down to verse 10. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there's gold, and the gold of that land is good. The bdellium and the onyx stone was there. And the name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. Now, 2 of those are still around today, Tigris and Euphrates. But it's coming out of the Garden of Eden, this river source, this spring source is flowing up out of Eden and then going into 4 different rivers. And so, again, this is very different than what we have today. You don't have this happening. The Tigris and Euphrates don't come out of this. So it's very different than what we presently have. So what we're trying to describe here is pre-flood earth, pre-flood land forms. Some might say Noah's lost world. What was it like when Noah was walking the earth prior to the flood happening? A couple other clues on the top of page 2 in your notes. Genesis 7 talks about the fountains of the great deep bursting open. We don't know if that was maybe springs beneath the ocean that somehow watered the seas or kept seas flowing. Proverbs 8 also talks about the springs of the deep. So it seems like, as you kind of put all this together, that this land mass that's created on day 3 is vastly different than what we presently know today on our modern continents. Because this water went into one place, as I said, it seems like God created one great big ocean. And from that, then, God formed dry land. And what's unique about this, it was fully ready to sustain plant life. As I talked about, it's this now suddenly it's ready to take seed, not even seed, it actually took real, live, fully grown plants. So by the end of day 3, you've got full-grown trees, you've got full-grown plants. All of that's in operation by the end of day 3. So this is really a supernatural event. God is raising up out of this watery matrix, dry land, that's going to be able to take plant life and vegetation. All right, so that's just kind of an introduction. It's different than what we know today. I want to explain that to you in just a moment. But any questions at this point, any thoughts at this point? Very straightforward. Yeah, Rachel.
I just had an observation. It's interesting, like the beginning of the world covered in water, and like we learned in Revelation last year that the seas will be not there in the new heavens and the new earth. And that's another question I would want to ask God, why, maybe there isn't, but it's just fascinating that like the way that the earth formed and how He created it was covered in water, but it won't be there like that in the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, that's a good question, good point. If you want to turn to Revelation 21, maybe we just look at that real quick. Revelation 21:1 says there's no longer any sea. But there is water. We know that there's going to be water in the new heavens and the new earth, because if you go over to chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, He showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street and on either side of the river was the tree of life. So in the new heavens and the new earth, there's clearly rivers. There's water flowing out of the new heavens, the new city of Jerusalem. Back on 21:1, it says there is no longer any sea. And there's different interpretations of what that means. Some people think it just means that there's no sea that is tempestuous and takes life. A lot of people die in the seas, ships go down and people drown. And so some people think it actually is just saying that it's not going to be this destructive sea. But it's very possible it literally means there's no sea as well. And it's sometimes hard to know exactly what he's referring to there. But interesting. Good point. All right. So back to your notes here. What I want to do for just a few moments is I want to see if we can explain a little bit more about what this land mass. So you can imagine there would have been the seas all gathered to one place. That's obviously massive seas because there's all kinds of water. By the way, water's not being created anymore. All the water that is in the universe was created on day, would that be day 1 or 2. There's no water being created. There's no water being destroyed. So the water levels in the universe are fixed right now. So all of that water would have gone into a basin known as the sea or the ocean. And what emerged was this dry land. Middle of page 2, there have been many attempts to explain what the world of Noah's day prior to the flood looked like. And in 1859, a creation geologist, he's actually a believer, Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, noticed that the jigsaw puzzle fit of North and South America with Europe and Africa if the Atlantic Ocean were not there. You've probably seen these pictures. Mm-hmm. You can take the Atlantic Ocean out and move all the continents together, and it looks like they fit. Yeah. It's like a big puzzle. And so he said, well, maybe that was what it was like pre-flood. So there was this massive supercontinent known as Pangaea. He called it Pangaea. Pan meaning all, Gaia meaning Mother Earth. So it's referring to the whole of Mother Earth. That's how he titled it, Pangaea. And so his thought was the supercontinent prior to Noah's flood was this thing called Pangaea, where it was just the assembling of all the continents into one massive supercontinent as they presently are, just kind of moving them all together. And that actually sounds pretty tenable. However, the bottom of page 2, in recent years, creation scientists believe that Pangaea could not have been the pre-flood supercontinent. They believe something else known as Rodinia. That was the title of the name that they gave that prior supercontinent, prior to Pangaea. Let me just read a couple quotes here because I think this will help explain. When we remove the Atlantic Ocean and put the pieces back together, we find a long mountain chain that ran from North America through Europe. So turn to page Stop right there. Turn the page. Look at the top of page 3, and you can see those red mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, then over to Newfoundland, which is that little island off the tip of Canada there. And then you go over to the British Isles. There's mountains there, sort of mountains, hills. And then all the way into Scandinavia, there are mountains up there. If you were to push all that together, take the Atlantic out, push it all together, that would line up. That'd be a straight line. All right? So those are the Appalachians and the Caledonian Mountains over in Europe. So back to the quote here. So we find a long mountain chain that ran from North America through Europe. The problem is that this chain, known as the Appalachian Caledonian Mountains, is made out of fossil-bearing sediments that were deposited earlier during the flood. In other words, those mountains have flood deposits in them and on them. So you see where this is going. It couldn't have been Pangaea. It couldn't have been the supercontinent of Pangaea that the flood just kind of then moved apart. Because what would have to happen prior to that in order to get flood deposits, dead animals, fossils, mud layers, what would have to happen prior to that for those to be on the tops of mountains? The flood would have to cover that area. So track with me, keep reading. The only known way to form a mountain chain like this is for one continent to collide with another continent. This means that the flood, so in other words, how do you get mountains like this? Continents have to collide. When continents collide, they push up and become mountains. This means, however, because there are flood deposits on the top of those mountains, this means that the flood had to deposit fossil-bearing layers in North America and Europe before they crashed into each other to form Pangaea. Thus, Pangaea cannot have been the pre-flood supercontinent that Noah lived on. It could have only been a temporary merger of continental fragments during the flood, lasting no more than a few weeks. Pangaea was a supercontinent during the flood, but it was completely underwater. So most creation geologists believe that there was something called Pangaea when they were all kind of assembled together, but it was not the kind of supercontinent that existed prior to the flood. There was another one, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. Let me give you one more quote, and then I'll show you a picture on the next page. Today's continents were once joined together because some mountain chains, such as the Appalachians and the Caledonians, are now separated by thousands of miles. But these mountains were not on the original supercontinent because they are made out of flood deposits. The only way such mountain chains could form is for the original supercontinent to break apart. Let me say that again. The only way for mountain chains could form is for the original supercontinent, called Rodinia, to break up. The plates then get covered by layers containing dead animals, and then they crash together temporarily. And then as these plates move again, they take with them pieces of the mountain chain formed by the collision, one piece in the US, one piece in the UK, and in Scandinavia. All right, so let me explain that to you in picture form. Go to page 3, because I know it's a little confusing. So what we're saying is look at the middle picture there. That gray shape to the left, that was the original supercontinent called Rodinia. We believe that it looked totally nothing like what we have today. So there was this original supercontinent that would have been formed on day 3 at the start of the flood that would have started to break apart. That then was covered with early flood deposits. So now you have the flood happening. Flood deposits come all over that land. They put down mud layers. They put down all kinds of dead animals and fossils. Then those plates collide to create mountains on a temporary supercontinent. That's where Pangaea, we believe, was created. And then those plates are separated to form today's continents. So I know it's kind of confusing, but that's what most people believe. That's the mechanism that most believe now took place, that there was an original supercontinent that then broke apart. The flood covered all of that with water, because that's what Genesis 6 or 8 says. The whole earth was covered with water. And then they came together for a while, broke back apart, and formed the existing continents that we have today. So
that happened all while the earth was flooded?
So the original the land mass created on day 3 would have held together
Right.
until the flood took place. When the flood took place, that thing started to break apart. Waters came all over the whole earth, flooded the whole earth, and in the midst of all of that, they came crashing back together at some point. We're talking weeks, months, maybe during the flood. The flood was a year long. So sometime within a few weeks, months, they came crashing back together, formed mountains. At the tops of those mountains are flood deposits. Then at some point during the flood, they began to move out, move away into what we presently have today as our continents. Okay, good question. So this is all speculation, all right? Here's why we believe that is because of the existence of those mud layers and those flood deposits at the tops of the mountains that make it impossible for that to have been Pangea prior to the flood. It had to have happened during the flood, so they could have all been covered and then broke apart. So bottom of page 3, we believe that original supercontinent would have been what was created on day 3. So then what did Rodinia, that's the name they assigned it, what did that look like? Geologists are fairly certain about the basic configuration of the core cratons. Cratons are the building blocks of the original land mass that were created on day 3. That's just the name they assigned it. I'll show you a picture in just a moment. But they're still unsettled about many of the details. There are multiple ways to fit together the fragmentary continental pieces of the puzzle, but we do have a reasonable picture of what happened at the catastrophic initiation of the flood. Huge plumes of molten rock probably blasted the underside of the Earth's crust like massive blowtorches. Eventually the crust was ripped apart, steam and molten rock burst forth, the supercontinent collapsed with slivers of land sliding into the ocean at the margins. It must have been a horrific sight. So go to page 4, and let me just give you, again, some pictures to kind of summarize what we're saying here. So I'm taking most of the stuff here from Answers in Genesis. They've had some helpful articles on this. So what we're saying is prior to the flood, the land mass that would have been created on day 3 is that left-hand picture, Rodinia. We don't know exactly what it looked like. That was just an artist's rendition of perhaps one big land mass and then surrounded by a massive body of water. That original supercontinent was made up of cratons, and you can see different colors that would have represented different parts and pieces of that original supercontinent. Then the flood happens, and the flood rearranges everything. You can see the middle picture there. It covered the entire earth with water, and it kind of rearranged those cratons for a time, and that's what we think Pangea probably was. That temporary reconfiguration of those original land masses pieces that were then totally covered with water, and then the right-hand side, towards the end of the flood, perhaps maybe even middle of the flood, however it happened, then those things moved apart, those cratons moved apart, and have what we have today. And you can see the different colors matching the different parts, and so you can kind of trace where the original pieces went. The U.S. had that yellow piece, South America the blue piece, Africa the red piece, Europe the green piece, China the tan piece, etc. So we think that's kind of what happened. Thoughts on this?
That's good.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is good. The pictures help.
It does help. I know trying to explain it in words is impossible. So we're kind of thinking that's maybe what happened. And if you look at Genesis 1 again, it doesn't say there were multiple continents of dry land. It just said dry land appeared. And it doesn't say that there were multiple bodies of water. It just technically says they were all gathered into one place. Genesis 1, verse 9. So this seems to be like a fairly tenable solution for how all this came about. Yeah, Rachel?
It is cool, too, to think that, like, even though the shape of the continents has changed and broken away, or it's different now, like, it's still the same amount of land that God created. It's not like China got bigger, like the whole, like, North America. It's just kind of a recycling, essentially, of the original creation.
Right.
So it's like really kind of cool to think that it's been our Earth is the land that we have has not gotten. It's not grown, essentially. It's just been reshaped.
It's been reshaped. Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Correct. Which, if that's true, then this is getting ahead of ourselves, but Noah never visited San Francisco area. Noah never walked in Antarctica. I mean, it's totally different. And so you have to kind of wrap your mind around that where Noah was is completely different than what we presently know. Yeah, Andy.
How I interpreted it is that the supercontinent, I mean, it's still saying, like she was saying, that we're saying that the same amount of land, like 23, I think, % land versus the rest water, is that doesn't account for the water that was above and below. And so from what I'm hearing from this is that I think it was opposite, that it was probably more like 70-80% land covered, way more vegetation. Fossil record shows like amber and diamonds, that they can find the amount of oxygen that's inside of those pre-flood fossils that have like 75% oxygen in them, showing that there's, and how would you get that? By having
More plants.
way more plants.
Because normal air is 22% oxygen.
Yeah. And yeah, what I've always thought about Pangea is, I mean, we're not lily pads just floating around in the water. There's dirt that goes all the way down to the middle.
Right.
But also in the flood, it's talking about waters from below.
Right.
And on your map showing the mountains, they all follow, even the Pacific Ocean. And everywhere there's a mountain range, in between them, there's the big, deep crevices in the sea. And so I believe that as the waters came up and there was water below, so it was more like a lily pad, that there was a layer of water a mile down, that as that water came up, those continents kind of settled and then smushed together, making those mountains. Because there's always in between the lines that runs parallel with mountains is that great fissure.
Sure. Good. Yeah, Mark.
Have you heard anything, and I don't know this answer, but as the continents moved and it changed the weight distribution of the Earth, did it change the axis and change seasons and give us seasons? Have you ever heard anything like that?
Well, I mean, we're going to get into it a little bit in day 4 when it says when the seasons were established.
Sure.
So if look ahead to verse 14, then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from night, and let them be signs and for seasons and for days and years." So if God established the seasons in conjunction with the creation of the heavenly bodies, I'm not sure the flood would have necessarily changed
Gotcha.
the seasons that were established on day 4. But I'm not a geologist either, so just giving you my perspective. Yeah.
That must have been one heck of a boat ride with Noah, because I'm thinking about all this catastrophic. He told Noah that he was going to destroy both them and the earth. And no wonder he had to shut him in. I can't get that off my mind now, thinking about what he went through and all of that, this cataclysmic worldwide disaster, and to come out of that unscathed, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm
is
actually
very
looking forward to getting to the flood.
Yeah.
And talking through some of that stuff. That'll be kind of fun. John?
Has with all of the cataclysmic changes to the earth, have they suggested ever that the size of the globe enlarged to accommodate this separation of continents, and even to the north you got Antarctica down here too, and Australia, and almost seems like a larger globe resulted to accommodate
From the flood or from this?
from the flood, to
Flood, yeah.
accommodate the configuration that we see now.
It's hard to know. I don't have an answer for you.
I just wondered if anybody had proposed any arguments to that effect.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it seems like God would have, my thoughts is he would have created the earth as it is, as he did in day 1. And then he just kind of was rearranging the elements in days 2 and 3. So rearranging the water, rearranging the land masses to get it ready for life. So I'm not sure that necessitates a larger globe, but who knows?
That would change a lot of issues of gravity.
It
Like
would.
Pluto, like a 200-pound man would weigh like 900 pounds. And so that larger the globe, the more. So like Mars being very small,
Yeah.
or the moon,
Yeah.
very light.
Exactly. Yeah. What'd you say?
They were commenting on his 900-pound man.
Yeah.
Making weight jokes.
Go to Mercury where you're a lot lighter. All right, bottom of page 4. So let's assume now that we have this supercontinent that was formed, this large landmass. It's now time for life, the first forms of life to be created, and it is the vegetation. On day 3, verses 11 to 13. Notice the bottom of page 4. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them." Here's our phrase again. And it was so. God said it, it happened. God said, "Let there be," and it came about exactly as he said. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their own kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, a third day. So look at the verse 11, just to note some things here. It seems like there's kind of different categories here. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation," maybe grasses, some of the smaller plants that would have covered the earth. Then plants yielding seeds, perhaps bushes and little larger plant structures, and then you have fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind. So it seems like even from the verbiage here, everything from the smallest forms of plant life all the way up to trees are created on day 3. And so page 5 here, now that we have dry land, God has commanded it to produce plants, and all kinds of plants suddenly, instantly filled the earth. I mean, again, this is so supernatural, you can't even fathom it. But just for a moment, try to fathom this massive supercontinent, dry. God says, "Let there be," and suddenly everything's green. From little blades of grass to bushes to fruit trees. And I don't think he created seeds that then grew over time. I think he created it fully formed, fully grown. So when if you were there on day 3, you would have been observing all this, and suddenly there's an apple tree with apples on it.
Yeah.
There's a pine tree with pine needles and pine cones on it. I don't think this was hey, let's create it and let it grow over time. No, I think this was an instantaneous, fully formed, fully functioning vegetation system. Yeah, Sherry.
The thing that fascinates me so much about that whole thing is that God spoke very few words, but the massive
Yeah.
amount of information
Yeah.
that was conveyed through those words to make all of that different stuff
Yeah.
exist. I mean,
Phenomenal.
if that doesn't make you worship right there, I mean, you know, it's like, I mean, you know, we think we're good at language, we think we're good at communicating, but I mean, to speak, let the earth sprout vegetation, and then it's like, he didn't have to sit there and give all the formulas for, okay, we're gonna make this, and we're gonna make this. I mean, it's like everything was in God's mind in
Yeah.
those few words, boom.
So he didn't say, let's make bluegrass, then let's make crabgrass, let there be mulberry bushes. No, it's just...
Crabgrass is after the fall.
Yeah, well, crabgrass would have been after the fall. That's true. Good point. Horrible stuff. But you're right. I mean, in an economy of words, he spoke it all, and the variety
Yeah.
and the diversity, it just
And the
shouts
flowers.
God's glory, and
Yeah.
it shouts his wisdom, and that's a good point. We need and his power.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. So we have here the first evidences of life on the earth. Again, this argues for a creator. This is so important. We already talked about evolution, but life cannot generate from that which is inanimate. You can't get life from rocks and water. You just can't get life from inanimate things. So now you suddenly have living things on the earth, and you have to have a creator that speaks those living things into existence. No matter how much time you give it, if you give it billions of years, and a sun and volcanoes and everything the evolutionists say happened, and suddenly there was this lightning bolt that created an amino acid and that developed, there's no way, because life cannot come from inanimate objects. And so all of this has the fingerprint of God all over it. So we have these fully mature, fully formed plants that are now over the surface of the whole earth. And just notice the word seed. We don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but notice verses 11 and 12. Plant yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. Same thing in verse 12. The word seed occurs twice. 4 times in those 2 verses you get the word seed. And maybe it's not the most interesting topic to talk about, seeds, but have you ever thought about a seed? Just think about what a seed is and what a seed does. You have within a seed, and by the way, think about all the kinds of seeds there are. There's the little dandelion seed that when it gets all puffy and white, and you give to your brother or sister and make them inhale it, and choke and everything. Those little things are meant to just fly through the air.
Yeah.
And then you've got pine cone seeds that have little seeds within them that are meant to open up and fall to the ground and germinate trees. And then you've got you got the twirly bird. Yeah, the maple things. Those are pretty cool. I remember playing with those as a kid. They just spin and twirl. Yeah, the whirly bird, the helicopter.
No. Is that what you said? Twirly bird? Is that what you called it?
Whirly bird, twirly bird, I don't know what it is.
I'm just making
Helicopter
sure.
seeds.
It's the helicopter seeds.
We called them twirly
birds.
Yeah, that's a non-theological term. And then you have little berries, that birds were to eat, and they would excrete those, and they would send them around that way. I mean, and then just think what's in a seed. Think that within a seed, God has built all the genetic information and all that is coded in there, everything that's necessary to produce another one of the same thing. That is phenomenal.
Yes.
I mean, how in the world do you come up with something like that?
Yes.
And we just kind of skip by seeds and we see them blowing in the wind and we crush them under our feet and we go buy them at the store and plant them and we don't think much of it. And yet, think about the phenomenal reality of what's in a seed.
Right.
It is a coded information meant to produce the exact same structure. Unbelievable. And so that's what you have now created on day 3. You have all of these seeds that are now built to be a multiplying system. Think about this. There's no need ever to create another tree because God has encoded within every plant a system to multiply itself ad infinitum. And so again, this just shouts the wisdom and glory of God. All right, so what I want to do for a few minutes is I want to walk through this whole issue of after its kind, which is what we just kind of started to talk about. And what I want you to do is I want you to notice that in verses 11 and verses 10 and 11, there is this phrase. Is it 10 and 11 or 11 and 12? It's actually 11 and 12. Notice that it says 4 times or a few times here, after their kind. Verse 12, after their kind. Verse 12, after their kind. And let me do a little Bible study here. Go down to verse 21. When we come to the sea creatures, we have them reproducing after their kind. And then we have the birds, verse 29, reproducing after its kind. Then verse 24, we have land animals, living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. Then verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. you're starting to see a pattern here. Go over to chapter 6, verse 19 and 20. Let me just show you a couple of other places. This is a very important little term. Chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. God says, "In every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female." Verse 20, "Of the birds after their kind, and the animals after their kind, and every creeping things on the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind." So you have a reference to it there. Go over to chapter 7, verse 14. You have another reference here. "They and every beast after its kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind." You see the theme. So multiple times in the book of Genesis, the little phrase "after its kind" occurs. It occurs 13 times in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy as well. And so I want to take a few moments to introduce this, because we've touched on this a little bit about adaptation, and is it adaptation? Is it microevolution? What is it? And I believe what you have in that little phrase is what we call speciation. You have the capacity for speciation within the genetic potential or the genetic variability of every created living thing. And so I want to get into that just a little bit, because we're going to hit it next week as well. I thought we'd just kind of hit it tonight, because this is the first place it's introduced here in the vegetation. So go back to Genesis 1. So let me give you a little insight into this whole idea of kinds. So page 5, a kind, the Hebrew word is min, is a category of related organisms that are capable of breeding with one another. That's how you can kind of define what belongs to what kind. They can interbreed. So if they can interbreed and produce offspring, they belong to the same kind. So the kind, by the way, the word baramin. Have you ever heard of the word baramin? Baramin is a Hebrew, or it's a term using 2 Hebrew words. Bara is to create, min is kind. A baramin is a created kind. That's another word for this whole category, this grouping. Baraminology, maybe you've heard of that, is the study of created kinds. And so anyway, this is roughly equivalent to the biological term family. So back to 10th grade biology, you remember the basic designations of biological organisms or organization: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The way I remembered that in 10th grade was King Philip came over from Great Spain. So if that helps you remember that. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so the kind, the biblical term kind, we think probably most correlates to the family of our structure. And so what that means is that anything within that family or within that kind has the capacity to reproduce with itself. In other words, like begets like. So whatever kind it is built within it the capacity to reproduce more of its own kind. So oak trees produce oak trees. Grasses produce grass. Sparrows produce sparrows. Cats produce cats. So within each kind it has the built-in capacity for reproduction. Bottom of page 5, the fact that creatures reproduce according to their own kind is a fundamental rule of genetics. Each organism has a unique DNA structure with genes and chromosomes that determine all of its characteristics. Careful breeding can emphasize or minimize certain characteristics with genotypes, but no amount of cross-pollination can cause a whole new life form to arise from the species that exist. And boundaries are set on which species may be cross-pollinated. Attempting to crossbreed an oak with a fungus would not produce any offspring whatsoever, much less a whole new species. So what we're talking about here is the ability within kinds for different species to arise from that kind because of the genetic material that's built within it. So top of page 6, let me explain this. This is very critical, I think, to understand. We never observe one kind evolving into a different kind. Instead of an evolutionary tree of life, we observe a creation orchard of God's created kinds with variation occurring only within those kinds. Do you have your notes from week 3, I think it was? If you have, let me see if that's what it was. Go back to the false religion and disastrous effects of Darwinism. I think that was maybe it was week 4. The false religion and disastrous effects of Darwinism. Go back to those notes, and then go to page 2 on those notes. And do you see that family tree at the top? That's an evolutionary tree. And so Darwin would have put this together. He says, well, we all kind of came from a common ancestor, so we can trace all of our lines back to that common ancestor. And so he built this tree, that humans came from primates, and then they were kind of connected to rodents along the way. It's this massive family tree built on an evolutionary mindset, all the way going back to an original common ancestor. That's different than what we're talking about. Now go back to the notes for tonight. What we're talking about tonight in speciation is the fact that there are still these trees, but not going back to a common ancestor as much as going back to the original kind. So that little chart we put on the top of page 6 there, butterflies, there was an original category or kind of butterflies that would have proliferated between its creation on day probably 6 for that. Then they proliferated and made various kinds of species, which then came to an end in the flood. And then they were on the ark, and so from that they would have spread out and diversified and made various species of butterflies. So the question is, why the different speciation? The chart we just looked at previously, an evolutionist would say, well, we all come from the same common ancestor. So we're just constantly evolving, and different life forms are producing life forms. But they say, this is very important, evolutionists say that there's species that can turn into other species. There's kinds that can turn into other kinds. And what we're saying is, no, that's not possible, because God has built within every kind a genetic potential that when those, let's say butterflies in this case, begin to reproduce, there's different combinations of genetic material that can produce over time a variety of species. That's not evolution. That is genetic potential built within the original kind that God enables those species to develop as they continue to reproduce and proliferate.
They're still butterflies.
What?
They're still butterflies.
They're still butterflies.
I remember these two talking about that when we were on that. Remember?
Yeah, we talked about that a few weeks ago.
Yeah. A duck can't turn into an elephant.
Butterfly will never turn into an elephant.
Yeah.
Monkey will never turn into a human. Different kinds. But we have to accommodate somehow for the speciation within those kinds. So why are there 30,000 different kinds of butterflies? Well, when God created a butterfly on day 6, how many kinds of butterflies did he create? One.
Oh, he created one.
He created one kind of butterfly. And from that kind came all the butterfly species that we have today. Now, an evolutionist says, well, it just all happened over time in billions of years and mutations, and that's the cause of it. And what do we say as creationists? No, we say God built within those butterflies a genetic variability that was expressed as they continued to reproduce. And I'll give you a chart here in just a minute that shows you how that happens. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it as simple as to compare, like when you have multiple children, they don't all look the same?
Exactly.
Right.
So is that
Exactly.
kind of like that idea?
Yeah, that's a great analogy, Thais. They're all humans, but they all look different. They have different skin tone, they have different hair color, they have different shape of eyes. There's some similarities because there's similar genetic material, but it's different. Why? Because there's different combinations of that genetic material happening. And so you do that long enough, and you let that go, and you look at all the different species that have arisen. It's because of the genetic variability built within that gene pool at the original creation of that kind. Let me explain it a little bit more. Under that chart on page 6, thus, it gets a little technical here, but stick with me. Thus, speciation is a direct result of the genes that define each kind and different versions of these shared genes called alleles, which result from mutations in pre-existing genes. So God built the original genetic material into each kind. And there's differentiation within those genes over time, but you also have mutations occurring because of the fall. And those mutations don't introduce new genetic material, they just slightly change some of the existing genetic material, and those changes are called alleles. And those alleles will then begin to combine in different combinations, and that's why you get the different speciation. Alleles are not different genes, but variations in genes that already exist within that kind's gene pool. All the genes in one generation available to be passed on to the next are called the gene pool. Members of the same kind may also be defined as organisms that share the same gene pool. The number of genes for different kinds of traits, the number in a complete genome, can be called the depth of the gene pool. A kind is defined in terms of the depth of the gene pool, which is the total number of different genes in a genome and a list of traits they encode for. Now this is important, this last sentence. Variation within a kind is defined in terms of the width of the gene pool, the number of possible alleles at each gene site. Geneticists call the shuffling of pre-existing genes recombination. So, kind of trace this back a little bit. God creates the butterfly kind. He creates one kind of butterfly, but built within that butterfly kind are different combinations of genetic material that can cause different species. Added to that is you have mutations after the fall that begin to affect that genetic material. And those add different variations as well. All right, last quote here, bottom page 6. Although the comparison is not perfect, a deck of cards illustrates the concept of variation within a created kind. So just imagine you have a 52 card deck, you're playing cards. You may spend the rest of your life dealing out cards. And if you get 13 cards in your hand, you may never get the same combination of cards, ever. But you're working with the same cards. It's the same genetic material. But you can get different combinations of that genetic material. The bridge hands dealt are unique, different, and constantly changing, like the individual members of a population. But the deck of 52 cards remains constant, never changing, always the same, like the kind. Individual variation plus group constancy equals variation within a created kind. So this is why we believe that there are species. The species have arisen because of different genetic combinations built and pre-programmed into each kind at the original creation. And over time, those combinations change, and you have different mutations developed to create those different species. Look at the little chart here to the left, and here's an example. Thais, you mentioned, what about kids? How do they look different? And maybe we can even take it back to Adam and Eve. We believe every single person eventually, or does, trace their existence back to Adam and Eve. But you look around the world, you've got black people, you've got red people, you've got people with different shaped eyes, you've got different hair. So how do you get that from one couple? How does one couple, Adam and Eve, produce the variety that we see within humans today and all the different things, different hair color, different eyes, different nose shapes, all of that. So the chart here gives an illustration with melanin, which is actually pretty helpful to think about right now as we're dealing with racial issues in our country. And let me just kind of give you a picture here. So you have in the genes of the mother's egg cells, you have let's call Adam and Eve the original couple, and this is kind of just example here. Their melanin control genes were uppercase A, lowercase a, uppercase B, lowercase b. They would have had medium skin tones. A would have been dominant, or uppercase would have been dominant, lowercase would have been recessive. So uppercase means dark, lowercase means light. So let's just assume for the sake of argument that Adam and Eve were both medium skin tone, and they both had the control genes capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. So that's the same for Adam and Eve. Now look at the possible combinations. You have the genes in the mother's cells on the top, you have the genes in the father's cells on the left. Notice the various combinations that could result from this. So if the mother passes on the capital A, capital B melanin gene, and that combines, and the father passes on also a capital A and capital B, you have now in that child the control genes capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B. And what color is their skin going to be?
Black.
Black. Because they have all the dominant control genes for dark skin. Now go to the opposite corner of the chart, the lower right-hand side. What if mom, in this case Eve, passes on lowercase a, lowercase b for melanin, and gene of the father does the exact same thing, Adam does the same thing, and it winds up as lowercase a, lowercase a, lowercase b, lowercase b. What do you have in terms of skin color?
White.
Light. And then notice everything in between. All the possible combinations that exist between those two extremes. You can have capital A, capital A, capital B, lowercase b. You can have two uppercase B's and one uppercase A and one lowercase a. You can have multiple combinations. And you can see the different shades and colors of the people skin based on just the combinations of genetic material. So having understood that, now do you understand why there can be black-skinned people, there can be light-skinned people, there can be people with different color skin in between all of that? It's because that code was built into the original genetic code in Adam and Eve, and that's why you have people in various parts of the world with various skin colors. We're all the same species, not species, kind. We're all human, but with different skin tones because of what was built into the genetic material from the original parents. So that's why we believe, how we believe speciation occurs. Not by billions of years, not by species moving from one to another through evolution, but genetic potential, genetic variability built within the original kinds at the day of creation. Thoughts? Cheryl?
I love what Ken Ham says. He says, this is white, and none of us are that color. We are all some shade of brown. The only people who are truly white are albinos, and that's a severe genetic defect. But he says, there are no truly white people.
Exactly.
We're all some shade of brown.
Some shade of brown. Good way to put it.
Yeah, he jokes about that song, red and yellow, black and white. He said it should say brown and brown and brown and brown. He said that. I heard him say that one time.
That's good.
Can't really sing that tune.
It doesn't have the same ring to it.
No.
Doesn't sound as cute.
So, yeah, Rachel?
I just think, I was thinking just about the fact, I don't know why, but the fingerprint is so fascinating to me, just that everyone, like out of, there's 330 million people in the US, but there's billions of people, billions, is that right, worldwide? I can't remember the population, but to have that many variances of a unique fingerprint or like a genetic code that you and you alone carry, and like over, 2,000 to 4,000 years of people being, people recreate, what's the one I'm looking for?
Reproducing.
Thank you, reproducing. Like just never having the same genetic kind of, your fingerprint's unique to you. It just completely blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like, if anything, that I don't know how much more proof do you need that, like, a creator kind of, made this so that you can't take any credit for it. Like,
Right.
we as humans can't take credit for our fingerprints and the way that our genetics have, like, who we are. Like, we can take absolutely no credit for that.
That's right.
So I just think it's really amazing.
Yeah, again, it just shouts a creator.
Yeah.
That's
It's
the
in
only.
the same category with the fact that he knows all of the stars by name.
Yes.
That
Mind
blows my.
mind-boggling.
Something to add as well, this also explains how Noah is able to fit all the animals inside the ark.
Good point.
What do you say?
Yeah. So Ewing made a good point on this is how Noah was able to fit all the animals in the ark. This was not a hard thing. I think I was reading this week. They believe that there would have been about 1,400 created kinds that he would have had to bring onto the ark. So one kind of cat, one kind of dog, one kind of monkey. So there weren't all kinds of species on the ark. There was just one kind of each. And so it made it fairly easy to bring those kinds onto the ark.
And he could have used babies too, so he could have brought in babies as well, so he wouldn't be doesn't have to be a fully mature animal as well. So that. Yeah.
Yes, which is one of the arguments evolutionists make against the flood, or critics of the Genesis will make of the flood. How could Noah have brought a brontosaurus onto the ark? Come on. He could have brought a little one on.
Let's get a blue one and a pink one.
Just a blue one and a pink one. You just need little brontosauruses. That's all you need. You don't need massive, big, huge, 600-year-old brontosaurus on the ark. So this explains a lot of things. So I think this is just phenomenal, and I wish we had more time to think about it. I remember back when I was in college studying genetics and just being floored by this. Just seeing all the different combinations and how all this was coded in, and still I wasn't fully embracing true biblical creationism, but still just marveling at the incredible diversity that God has built within his creation at the cellular level, and it's all encoded there. I mean, just incredible. Shouts a creator. So, any other thoughts on speciation? I wanted to cover that tonight because we're going to get to it again, and I don't want to cover it again, but this is the first time we get it here in Genesis 1. So, yeah.
This also shows how kind of ludicrous racism is, because when you look, it's like what Cheryl said, we don't choose what we are born with, what color of brown, and how we're all, related in a sense. And I don't know, it's just like what makes us think that because of a region we're from or a skin color we have, that we have some kind of, superiority to someone else.
Yeah.
It's just so godless.
It is.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. It is godless. Racism is godless. Racism is a failure to acknowledge what God has done in creating the human race. Good point. Okay, let's go to page 7, just a few more things. So again, this is what we believe biblical adaptation is. Some people might call it microevolution. I prefer the term speciation, because I think that better describes what we're talking about. So obviously all of this argues against evolution, that there's no evidence anywhere of organisms moving across the species line or moving across the kind lines. It's impossible. So all of this is a massive argument against creationism. And I think last time a couple times ago, we talked about the fact that lions and tigers can mate, and so they produce a liger, and horses and zebras can mate, and they can produce the zorse. Why? Because they're all within the same kind. And so it's all built within that genetic material for that kind. One other thing here to just think about before we move on to day 4 is, why did God create plants before the sun? Interesting. If plants need sun to live, why did he create them on day 3 and the sun on day 4? So a couple reasons. Maybe, perhaps, to underscore that life did not come from the sun. What do evolutionists teach? Life comes from the sun. And so perhaps God in his wisdom knew what the world would do and how they would redefine this. And so maybe that's one of the reasons. Maybe another reason is to undermine the inclination of the human heart to worship the sun as the source of life. What do pagans do? They worship the sun.
That's what the Egyptians did.
Yep, the Egyptians did, the Sumerians did. Unregenerate man will worship something. Romans 1 says they worship the creature rather than the creator. So maybe God just created plant life before the sun to be absolutely certain and clear that life did not come from the sun. So you don't worship the sun. You worship God.
Did you ever figure out if the first trees had rings?
Had rings? That's a good question, John. That's like, did Adam have a navel question?
That's right. There you go.
That's a good question.
Ponder that.
I'll have to ponder that one. Not sure. The fact that plants were created before the sun argues against the idea of days in Genesis being long periods. How could plants survive for thousands of years without the sun? So, theistic evolutionists want to say, well, the days in Genesis 1, they're probably just billions of years. So God used evolution. The word days in Genesis 1 just means billions of years, long periods of time. You run into a real problem if you have a billion years worth of plants and no sun. That's a problem. So God, again, is just infinitely wise in describing how he did all this. All right, so that's day 3. Questions? Thoughts? We're going to move on to day 4 and try and wrap this up for tonight. All right, day 4, we come to the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. We have on the day 4 now God filling the outer space that he created on day 2. And so we have sun created, moon created, stars created, planets created, asteroids created, comets created. Let me just read Genesis 1, 14 to 19. It says, Then God said, Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Here it is again. He said it. And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, a 4th day. So top of page 8, we seem to have kind of 2 phases of God's creative work. We have days 1 to 3, he's forming things. Days 4, 5, and 6, he's filling those things, which kind of makes sense. If you look at verse 2 in Genesis 1, the earth was what? Formless and void. So what does he do in the first 3 days? He forms. What does he do in the next 3 days? He fills. There's a formless part of it, and it's void. So in creation, he's forming and he's filling. And there's some parallelism there. In day 4, the sun, moon, and stars are filling the universe that was created, the space, the outer space. Day 5, he creates the fish and birds to fill the sea and the sky that are made on day 2. Day 6, he creates land animals and humans to fill the land that he created. So on day 4, we have the beginning of this filling phase, this filling of the universe that he's already partially created. So what did he create on day 4? Or why did God create sun, moon, and stars on day 4? Let me just give you three reasons that God created sun, moon, and stars. First is to separate day from night. Genesis 1:14, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Verse 18, God to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. So one of the reasons God created sun, moon, and stars is to separate the day from the night. Now that's kind of already partially happened on day 1. Because what did he do on day 1? He separated light from darkness. And he called the light day and the dark night. So it's kind of already happened, but what we have now in day 4 is the creation of the heavenly bodies that now define that separation. So look under the verses here. Although God had already separated light from dark and day from night on day 1, the creation of the heavenly bodies on day 4 serves as a permanent marker of that separation. What had been a disembodied blanket of diffused supernatural light was now superseded by a universe full of light-bearing bodies. The alternation between day and night continued, but now heavenly bodies provided the varying degrees of light. So on day 1, we had light, and we had dark, and we had day, and we had night. We had a fully functioning earth, 24-hour cycles. Now when you come to day 4, we have heavenly bodies created to specifically define those arenas. So the moon corresponds to the night, and the sun corresponds to the day. So we have the formation here of sun, moon, and stars. So you can read bottom of page 8 on your own, just some incredible facts about the sun, its size, its location, its diameter, its temperature. Incredible thing. It's a star, a yellow dwarf, which is a small to medium star. So just some interesting facts about it. Bottom of page 8 then is the moon. It's created to rule the night. So sun created to rule the day, moon created to rule the night. Some interesting facts you can read about the sun on your own. Top of page 9. So that's kind of the reason God creates these heavenly bodies. He has separated light from darkness and day from night. Now he's kind of formalizing that with the creation of the heavenly bodies that are associated with day and night. And so sun corresponds to the day, moon corresponds to the night. And it all comes into existence with a word. All right, so that's one of the reasons. Second reason God does this is to govern the seasons. To govern the seasons. Look at verse 14. God says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years." In other words, God created heavenly bodies to help us mark time, to help us mark our calendars, to set our calendars by. Look at the second bullet there. They mark the passage of time. The sun determines our days. The moon determines our nights. And the sun, moon, and stars all together in their orbits determine our seasons and our years. So those seasons help us know when to grow crops. They set weather patterns. They establish time. All of that is established on day 4. Yeah, Sherry.
So, I don't remember when God created light, was the earth rotating at that point?
I think it had to have been.
But when he created the sun, was now the earth is rotating, going around?
Yeah, so I think it had to have been rotating on its axis on day 1, because what does he say at the end of day 1? It was evening.
Day, yeah.
Yep, it was evening and morning, day 1. The only way you get that is by a rotating earth and a light source.
Yep, and now I remember.
Yep.
We did say that.
Yep.
So, but once the sun is created now, so now it's rotating and making that trip around the sun.
Correct.
Okay.
So prior to this, you don't have any time frame really to measure the passage of time. And he's creating in time, he's creating in days, but the earth itself is not yet defined by a framework of time. It's spinning 24 hours, but it's not rotating around an orbit in a solar system. That's what happens here on day 4. So now we have...
So God actually, he created the framework for time, and the earth isn't actually creating the framework, for time. God actually created it by how?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It is cool. And added to this, so think about this. What is a day? What defines a day?
24 hours.
Okay, 24 hours. What?
Full rotation of Earth.
Full rotation of the Earth. Full rotation of the Earth defines a day. What defines
Rotation of the sun.
movement of the Earth, one complete rotation around the sun? What defines a week?
7 days.
7 days. Good, Joan.
God knows.
Genesis.
Genesis. What is a week? A week is defined by the creation week,
Oh, yeah, day and night.
right?
Yeah.
How do you get a week? You get a week by God establishing the creation week. 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest. That's where we get that time frame. But the other time frame, day, night, 24-hour period, a year, all that's defined by the solar system. Now, obviously still a week is fitting into a solar calendar and that kind of thing, but the week itself is defined by the creation week. Whereas now on day 4, the heavenly bodies define day, year, etc. So, very interesting. Make sense?
Yeah.
So why do you have a calendar? Why do you have a clock? Because of day 4. Because everything is marked by what the sun and the rotation of the earth are doing. Yeah, Rachel.
So maybe this is very naive of me in elementary, but I just kind of always, maybe my mom told me this, I don't know. Like winter was a result of the curse, like that seems, I don't know like why I thought
agree,
that, but
love
didn't,
that.
like I feel like I was taught that as a young child that like winter was a result of the fall because like winter is harsh and cold and that's obviously not true, but like for some reason in my mind it just like clicked and like that the seasons included all of the
There's
seasons
death.
and that they have like it. But winter does represent death, essentially, kind of. Like, when things die, I wonder, like, if maybe it was just, maybe their season was different. Like,
Well, they didn't
Not
have
as
clothes,
drastic.
so
What?
maybe not,
they didn't
yeah.
have clothes.
I mean, how did
Yeah.
they survive?
Yeah.
Or that.
I'm just thinking through, like, just the seasons. Like, obviously, if they've been established by God, that's awesome. And, like, great, they're not cursed. But maybe the result of the fall has kind of maybe made them so harsh. Because, like, how would have Adam and Eve survived in winter? I wonder.
That's interesting. I had to think about that some more. Can we say that winter is the result of the fall?
I know I was taught that as a child. Anyone else?
It makes sense.
I'd say it's a result of the flood.
That's what I was just going to
Yeah.
say. I think
Yeah.
the winter is a result of the flood.
That's right.
Because
Because
the
in
flood.
LA,
judgment.
there's no winter,
Winter's judgment.
but there's still seasons.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a good point.
Say that again?
Wait,
Yeah.
what did you say?
Like in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles,
Yeah.
there's no winter.
California.
Right.
But
They have
there's still
seasons,
Right.
Yeah.
but they're nice seasons.
They don't have
And there is snow up in the mountains around LA. But I would agree with that. I would say that the winter is a result of the flood. The flood changed that weather patterns. But God speaks about snow. So in the scriptures, where to the store? Job, he says to Job, can you cause the snow to happen? So God is not entirely out of the realm of snow. It's not just a curse. But people die in the snow.
Right.
And so that is obviously a effect of the fall. But I'm not sure, I don't think I could say the winter itself.
In the heat too.
What?
People die in the heat.
Yeah, that's true. Good
Yeah.
point. That's why Michigan's better to live in anyway, right? Ewing, what were you going to say?
Oh, I'm just completely, I guess, not completely off topic, but have you tried paralleling, Job 26, comparing that with Genesis 1? Have you tried doing that?
Yeah, I think there's some similarities there. I'd have to go back and look, but there's some similarities to day 1, or days of creation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you did any comparison between them and so just my thought.
You actually have it in Proverbs 8 as well. You have some parallelism between days of creation there and in Genesis 1 as well. So there's some other places where it does occur.
Yeah.
Yeah. Suzanne, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say that even though snow might not have been happening early on before the flood, like the seasons were still established
Yes.
for that coming, like there's still a fixed part of the calendar that winter happens and that was built into that.
From day 4.
From day 4.
Yep, exactly.
Well, but I also wonder if they just didn't live in the parts where it was that much more harsh, because you don't have snow everywhere in the world.
And this gets back to the question of what was the original structure of the
England.
continent like.
Yeah.
I don't think the original
greenhouse.
supercontinent would have had snow on it. Maybe I'm naive on this, but with the greenhouse kind of effect and the hothouse effect, I'm not sure you had snow. I'd have to go look into that a little bit more, but I would think it would be more post-fall, where you would have snow in various post-flood, where you'd have various snow in various regions.
Just question on the snow. I thought seasons are determined by how close you are to the center of the circumference of the Earth, like the center. Equator? Yeah.
Equator.
Well, it all kind of fits together, but
Yeah, yeah.
so the Earth is tilted on an axis 22.5 degrees.
That's correct.
And so when it's moving, when it's tipped away from the sun, when North America is tipped away from the sun,
Right.
you're in a season of fall and winter.
Right.
And that happens 6 months out of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Then you come around, and now North America is on the other side, and now you've got it is spring and summer. So it's not just the location on the equator, although that does affect it, or in relation to the equator. It's also where the Earth is in relation to the sun.
Right.
That affects it as well. Yeah. All right, let me wrap this up real quick. Last thing God did on day 4 was to provide light. So he created sun, he created the moon. The sun governs the day, the moon governs the night. Page 10, the sun radiates the light during the day, the moon reflects the light at night. So these are light sources. Actually, the moon's not a light source, it's just reflecting the light of the sun. But it still, from our perspective, kind of comes across as a light source. And then this, I gotta wrap this up this real quickly, but verse 16, notice the last phrase of verse 16. This is tremendous. He made the stars also. And actually in the Hebrew, it's just the stars also.
Wow.
The stars also.
Wow.
In 3 words,
Wow.
God describes how he's created every single star in the universe. Oh, and he made the stars. Moving on. Incredible. That the 100, notice the next to the picture here, assuming an average of 100 billion stars per galaxy means that there are 1 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. And and the stars also. And as John said earlier, Isaiah 40 and Psalm 147 say he's numbered them and he's named them all. Just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
How in the world? This just speaks of the sovereignty and the power of God. And so the last thing, bottom of page 10, what this should do is this should show us the infinite greatness of God in his majesty and his glory, and it should point to the insignificance of man.
Right.
We're just soulmate. We're just man, what would you take thought of him?
Right.
You've done all of this,
Right.
and yet you take thought of us.
Right.
So that's kind of the takeaway from all this. We can get caught up in the details and the nuances and the explanations, but leave with that. We have an incredibly majestic God, and he knows us. Peons in his little peons and minuscule parts of his massive creation, and he knows us.
We should use the word awesome just for God.
Absolutely.
Not anywhere else.
Yeah, don't tell me your wet burrito was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, let's talk about God being
I
awesome.
don't use awesome for anything else, but yeah.
All right, see you next week. Days 5 and 6 next week.
That clock is wrong. I'm saying wrap it up, and I'm thinking, we got an hour. What are you talking about?
That's a reminder to set your clock.
That's a reminder.
Saturday night.